Well, Ed Korry is a University of Chicago graduate and also attained his master's in conjunction with the University of Cairo. His pre-collegiate education from the age of 9 includes St. Peter's Court Boys Preparatory Boarding School in Broadstairs, Kent, England. He then attended Harrow, founded in 1572, a private school known in the United Kingdom as a public school, until attending university. As the only American in attendance, he provided Ed with an outsider's perspective of the unique education that the English public school offered. Ed is a retired professor and the permanent chair at Johnson & Wales University. So his presentation today is titled, well, What Byron, Winston Churchill, Nehru, and Benedict Cumberbatch have in common, an English public school. So on behalf of the English-Speaking Union, Central Florida Branch, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ed Korry. Ed?
Thank you very much. All right, thank you, and as you're going to see, coincidentally, Ovid, you appear in your former self in this presentation. Okay. So what do Byron, Lord Byron, Winston Churchill, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Benedict Cumberbatch have in common? Well, they all went to Harrow School. Okay, and I appreciate this opportunity because it really made me reflect after 50 plus years on the experience, and I hadn't given it as much thought. I actually read 4 additional books, one which was 600 pages in length, but was a detailed, very detailed history, and gave me a better understanding. As you'll see, I'm going to quote my headmaster later on, and it's about myths and how we transfer myths and then don't want to disillusion people. So I appreciate that. The books that I depended on particularly was Christopher Tarman, who taught, was a master at Harrow and a fellow at Cambridge. The other was one that I'd read long ago, E.D. Laborde, who was housemaster of the Park boarding house. And actually I knew him, but he wrote that in the 1950s. And then 2 books that I got on my Kindle, because there's just way too many books in the Korry household. One called Posh Boys, How English Public Schools Ruined Britain, by Robert Verheyen. And the other one is Engines of Privilege by Francis Green and David Kinniston. So I'm going to start off by hopefully not thoroughly embarrassing myself, but I thought I'd start off that way so that by the end of the presentation you'll have found the grace to forgive me. And so if you're okay.
Visions of boy which shall float at before you, echoes of dream that shall bear them along. Follow up, follow up, follow up, follow up, follow up, till the field ring again and again, with the tramp of the 22 men. Follow up, follow up.
So, just so we're not bothered with that. I'm not a singer, and I just didn't want to do it solo. So somebody asked me, you know, do you speak with an English accent? You know, you can't, it's not that difficult. You just have to pretend you've got marbles in your mouth and don't open your mouth very wide so that nobody can lip read. All right? And that way you're definitely identified as being part of the upper class. All right? So some people are astonished that as opposed to my shorts and whatever shirt I'm wearing, I'm actually pretty much in the Harrow getup, including this 55-year-old boater. And that was a requirement at the school. And I was appalled to find out that these cost 60 pounds today. Okay. Those were also school scarves, the regular Harrow school scarf, and that only given to the philatelic club that I will mention a little bit later. So, you know, my objectives today is just to present Harrow School as a model for English public school. It's different from others for sure, but you know, as Dorothy Sayers in one of her books said, you know, one of the characters says, "Did you go to school?" Yes, Eton, and you Harrow, you know, as if there were no other schools that one could possibly go to. I'll give a context of the colorful historic and personal background to this. Very briefly review the educational structure because that would take a couple of sessions. It's so muddled. Refer to how it impacted the origins of our educational system and still, I believe, has some influence. And discuss at the end the societal implications of such systems. So, you know, how did I end up at Harrow? Because context is everything. I was an almost, I put, full-time participant. The reason I say that is because my mother raised me as a Roman Catholic. My father wasn't. And she did not want me to participate in chapel or Anglican services. So there was chapel every morning. So I got out of not being in chapel. And in a sense, I regret it because it really wasn't about religious services except for on Sunday. And I was you know, accompanied to ensure that I attended Catholic Mass in the village below. I was already ingrained to a slight degree because when my father was appointed U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia and that there was an American school, he would not allow his kids to go to it because it was run by, it was a MAG school, military school, and he said it had a Jim Crow curriculum and they wouldn't allow Ethiopians to attend. So I was in a class at the age of 9 and 10 that had as many as 14 different nationalities. But what was difficult was the Europeans who were a distinct minority, and I include being the only American in that class. You know, we were 9 and there were kids in the same class that were 14 to 15 years old, which doesn't make for necessarily a good situation. So I actually went to my parents and said, look, I don't think that being here is a good idea. So they reached out to friends of theirs, and the cost actually was lower to go to England, and they could see me 3 times a year instead of 2, and the distances were shorter, et cetera, et cetera. So off I went to St. Peter's Court in Broadstairs, Kent, known as a prep school. They're feeder schools for public schools. When I say public schools, I'm talking about fee-paying, non-state affiliated schools. In fact, the state has almost no control over them whatsoever. So the Broadstairs is this tiny community between Margate and Ramsgate. It takes about 35 minutes on the train from Waterloo Station, and it was known as a smuggler's den, and also of note was Dickens's Bleak House. So that is me on the left, and the son of the family that he was already attending. He was a year older than I was, and that was the uniform. Thankfully, only the youngest had to wear +4s. Okay. They were established actually in the mid-19th century because, and I'll talk about dame schools in a little bit, but dame schools were attached to public schools where they would teach the younger pupils how to read and write and really basic subjects. And they were referred to as dame schools because they were boarding houses that widows tended to have and took care of the younger boys. This school actually closed 2 years after I left. I ended up being the head boy. The owner of the school was already about 70. His mother, who I used to sit opposite for all the meals, was well into her 90s. And it was part of the job of the head boy to try to entertain her at the same time. It was amalgamated with Wellesley House, which was just down the road. But it did introduce me to the real rigors of English private schools. The academics were quite stringent. You had no time to yourself. And when I talk about regimentation, you know, after breakfast, you had a specific time slots, 15 boys at a time, to use the 15 available toilets, and you had 5 minutes to do your business, and that was it. All right? And you learned. You learned. Okay. Discipline included some harsher aspects, but sports were critical. I fondly remember a game called Conkers, which were horse chestnuts that were about this big. I mean, they come in different sizes, but as big as, you know, about this big. And you'd pick them off the ground. We had horse chestnut trees all over. You'd let them harden. You could even varnish it, put a hole through it, put the string through it, tie a knot, and then you would hold yours and let it hang, and somebody else would whack it with their conker. And, you know, I know one of mine lasted 130 bouts. The bout ended when one of the two was demolished or came off the strip. But the discipline part, so I was in the headmaster's class, and Latin, I had already, was 3 years behind other boys. I started at 10, and other boys started at the age of 7. And so I was behind, but I'd been there for, you know, 3 years. And we used to have to translate Ovid's Tristia, and the classrooms were on the first floor, the dormitory rooms that would hold 15 or 20 beds with washstands in the middle and piss pots underneath. And Fred, who had a prosthetic leg from lost from the war, would bring in the hot coals in this tiny little fireplace that was supposed to heat a room half this size, and then pour out about an inch of hot water, and you rush up to get some, especially during the cold months, some hot water to splash on your face and take care of your other business. And we would dash across the hallway to the headmaster's bedroom / study. He had a Murphy bed, and he would deliberately leave it, you know, for 15, 20 minutes vacant, so the boys in his class could rush and check to see whether or not they might get beaten that particular day. Because if you scored less than 60% on the you know, every week there were 2 exercises that we'd have to do. 8 to 10 sentences translated from English into Latin, and if you got less than 60%, the first time you had a little stick figure drawn without the stick, and the second time with the stick. And it wasn't until late in the afternoon So you had, a good 6 to 8 hours to contemplate that you were going to get beaten. And it was entirely ritualistic, okay? Where you would follow the headmaster and all the pupils in the class. There were only like 10 or 12. The head boy would grab his ovid and start reading in iambic pentameter, and everybody in the class would be beating their hinged desktops in iambic pentameter, and the point was to see if you could get the farthest through the Tristia in comparison to the preceding 75 years, okay? And I distinctly remember, as I was leaving, that what I heard was Me miserum quanti montes volvuntur aquarum iam tacturus sidra summa putes. Quantae deductos subsudent aequaero vales iam tacturus tartara nigra putes. O wretched me, what vast mountains of water, coming down my cheeks, heave themselves aloft. Now you think they will touch the highest stars. What mighty abysses settle beneath us as the flood yawns apart. Now you think they will touch black Tartarus, which is where Ovid was being exiled by Caesar Augustus in 8 AD, or common year. Okay? Yes, indeed, you would take your jacket off, pull the back of your shirt so that it wasn't in. You'd bend over from the back of the chair, reaching down, and you could see him with his whole faggot of canes, and you'd hear and he'd select the one, and you'd got one, he'd take 2 or 3 steps, whack, and then the backhand was always the worst because it didn't hit you here, you got you somewhere down here. And you couldn't sit for the rest of the day. In fact, you'd have welts and bruising for 3 weeks. Okay, so these were, let me tell you, anybody who says that fear doesn't promote learning is wrong. I don't recommend it. I do not recommend it, but I'm telling you, it does work. So now, as a preamble, private education was brought to England by the Romans. As opposed to the Romans, the Greeks depended on the community for education. But Roman education were, if you were wealthy enough, by private tutors, but less well off, but still able to pay, they paid in private schools. And actually, later on, the Emperor Diocletian actually gave out edicts on the pay scale. So elementary schools could charge only 10 denarii per pupil per month, whereas those in grammar schools, the equivalent of grammar schools, where you learn rhetoric and grammar, could charge 5 times that amount. So Rome brought literacy to the ruling elite until they lost that island to the barbarians. And it isn't until St. Augustine and Christianity was brought in 597, in the Common Era, with an army of monks and clerics that were directed by the Pope, Pope Gregory, for conversion. And to have Mass, you needed Latin and you needed singing. Okay? So the first school, and probably the longest continuously operating school globally, is King's School, Canterbury, that was established in 597 CE. And right here is actually the Norman stairwell, and a lot of this is quite original. It was a local free grammar school for local boys to be able to learn Latin so that they could enter the clergy. There were also song schools, song schools established so that they could sing the hymns as a necessary part of High Mass. Okay? Now, other cities or towns such as York and Rochester, also established the earliest grammar and song schools. If you go about 300 years later, during Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, 871, in the Common Era, he organized religious teaching and education through individual priests and had the liturgy and everything translated from Latin into Anglo-Saxon. Okay? Well, that period came to an abrupt end with the Norman invasion. Hastings, Battle of Hastings, 1066. The Christian, quote, schools reverted back to Latin. Okay? And the Normans were not particularly interested in education, other than vocational education for local boys to be, who were aspiring to be monks and priests. The young nobility, most of whom were quite illiterate. Okay? And after 300 years of Norman rule, it's estimated that actually less than 5% of the population could read or write. So in the 14th century, in Bedford, Christchurch, Waltham, they established grammar schools, but removed them from monastic control. One of the earliest, Bury St. Edmunds, also known as St. Edmundsbury, established in 1125, was endowed as a free or partially free grammar school. Remember, the main purpose is religious education and the learning of Latin. Okay, but in general, the lords of the manor thought that education was a threat. In the 14th century, the song schools, the chantry schools, from the French chanter, they were established. Wealthy Christian benefactors established these through endowments and made them free for local boys, or in some cases, free and partially free for non-local boys. They molded their schools in their own image. So the earliest one in this model was William Wickham, who had some grammar school education himself. He was a farmer's son and worked his way to being the closest advisor to King Edward III. He established the new college at Oxford in 1379, and then established Winchester College in 1382 to be a feeder school for the new college and other colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. He did not want an elite school, so it was mostly about free for local boys, but not exclusively. People who go to Winchester are known, the alumni, as Wickhamists or Old Wickhamists.
Ah.
Wickhamists, and this will give you an idea later on, Jeremy Corbyn and people in his, not Jeremy Corbyn himself, but his leading advisor and others went to Winchester. Okay, this is the socialist and leftist end of the Labour Party. Okay. In 1381, there was the Great Peasant Rebellion, which sent a shudder through the entire hierarchical structure. So at that time, chantry schools were reformed into grammar schools, so that while they may continue to teach singing, the curriculum was expanded beyond just Latin and singing. Winchester, which really served as a very different model, because one of the things that happened with these schools is they were removed from monastic control. Okay, this is before the Reformation. Okay, they were removed from the monastic orders, and actually all chantries were dissolved along with the monasteries in 1545 under King Henry VIII. So Winchester served as the model for Eton that was established in 1440 by King Henry for local boys, for no fees, but allowed for fee-paying foreigners. St. Paul's, Westminster, in Harrow in 1572, or was it? So, where is Harrow? Well, this is the center of London, down on your bottom right-hand corner. And Harrow is about 10.5 miles away from the center of London. And on a clear day, which is not very often, you could actually see Westminster Towers. Okay. The suburbia expanded to the point that towards the late 19th century, it was starting to spread out to as far as Wimbledon, which is not that far from Harrow on the Hill in Harrow. And as you'll see, a very astute headmaster bought 250 acres of surrounding pastoral land that was used for grazing, the grazing of animals. And that had enormous impact on Harrow's development. This is the crest of Harrow. And you see two silver arrows, which I will talk about in a bit. It's Stet Fortuna Domus, let the fortune of the house stand, and Donorum Dei Dispensatio Fidelis, faithful dispensation of the gifts of God. So Harrow was founded or rechartered, because the charter set forth by Queen Elizabeth II in 1572 include the words de novo irrigere, which is a renewal. Okay, and there was a former grammar school there, not that building, but in 1324. And Queen Mary, before Elizabeth, actually sent one of her protégés, her deceased protégés, 2 sons, and paid for them to go to this grammar school at Harrow, and it was known as a good school. It was set up for both free scholars and foreigners. This is the original building. It was not completed until 1615 when the first pupil arrived. The interior of this Tudor building is the 4th form room on the, as you can see, and there were actually 4 concurrent classes in each section of the wood paneled room. The wood paneling is completely covered with graffiti, where famous and the non-famous engraved their names, including Byron, as you see here, Churchill did as well, etc. So the charter stipulated that the master had to have a master's degree and that the usher of the lower school, responsible for teaching the lower end of the school, had a bachelor's degree, and they came primarily from Trinity College. And also they were very closely tied to Eton. People think that there was a great rivalry. There wasn't a sense, but they co-developed, if you will. At one point, 75% of the masters were formerly at Eton or graduates of Eton, and vice versa. The boys originally limited to 60. There's now 840. When I was there was 730. The numbers used to go up in the 19th century to like 300, 340, but in a couple of periods absolutely collapsed because of economic conditions within the UK. Latin and religion was the primary focus. Boys had to bring a lantern with them because classes started at 6 a.m. and concluded at 6 p.m. They had to bring their own ink and paper and 3 arrow shafts, bowstrings, and a bracer. An archery competition was started, the silver arrow competition. That's why I alluded to it in the crest. I mentioned the school dames being responsible for overseeing the younger boys. The boarding fees would go to the master, so headmaster's was the first boarding house, and he collected all the fees. And so actually, they got quite wealthy off of those fees. The usher started taking in boarders, and so there was always this rivalry between ushers and other masters who set up in their own homes. The houses weren't owned by Harrow, and so they collected all the fees. I want you to keep in mind that Boston Latin was established in Massachusetts as a school in 1635. So the Harrow in the 18th centuries went from local boys to the land-owning class. At the beginning, it was 1 in 3 boys part of the land-owning class. And so the system of boarding houses became more regimented. In terms of the curriculum, it expanded and included drama and oratory, which is very important. Sports developed in the UK in public schools in the 18th century, so that cricket had developed as did various forms of football that, and I'm talking about soccer, that didn't get finalized until a century later. But every school had its own form of football. The slant started to veer away from the clergy, service to what was a foundational empire that needed service. That included the military as much as civil service. Free time, there was free time, which caused massive discipline issues, hooliganism, rioting, a lot of drinking, and so masters, wanting to take the cane to an aristocrat's son was problematic. And that problem was solved in the next century, as I will show you. Sports became more and more of a factor. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. In the 19th century, there was a commission to really look at the public schools, and the two that are asterisked were not really focused upon because they weren't boarding schools, they were day schools. The other schools were primarily boarding schools. And the question was, all of them had these charters for non-fee paying local boys, and that segment of the population almost disappeared. So what did it mean? So they redefined, in a sense, what a public school was, and that they were marvelous institutions for the British Empire, right? And so these schools veered away from their original endowment, okay, and purpose. A leading figure in English education was Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of a rugby school. And, he said that first, in terms of the education that boys were to get, was first, religious and moral principle, secondly, gentlemanly conduct, and third, academic ability, okay? So, for the discipline to be instilled, he relied on the senior boys selected as monitors to adjudicate and administer the canings, because now you had aristocratic boys beating the crap out of the rest of them, okay? And that was acceptable to their parents, okay? So, the system that evolved also had a system called fagging, different connotation to a certain degree, but this was when the younger class, from shells and remove, like the equivalent of 9th and 10th grade, would have to make the beds, run errands, brush clothes, polish shoes of the monitors. And when I was there, the fagging system was still current, and you'd hear at specific times in the afternoons after sports, and if there was no afternoon class, because we did have class until 6:45 p.m. on 3 days of the week, you'd hear, boy, boy, boy. And so anybody who was a fag had to rush, because if you didn't, if you were constantly not one of those being selected because you got there last, you were in trouble. Okay, so our house proudly voted against the whole system. There were still monitors, but they weren't able to do much of anything. And that was in 1968. And the other house masters looked at our house master, Raymond Venables, with approval. Okay. The connections to the other schools, as I said, were particularly strong, especially Eton and Winchester. There was, for a period of time, a dearth of Oxford and Cambridge graduates, but at this time, 30% of Rovians would end up being officers in the military. We're now going from the clerical to an empire. So they hired George Gilbert Scott, and those of you that have listened to the presentation a couple of weeks ago would be familiar with George Gilbert Scott, who was the architect for St. Pancras railway station, amongst others. And that's the Harrow Chapel. It's completely different from all the other structures when I went there, which were Tudor or neo-Tudor in style. And this thing wasn't at all. And, this is the age of muscular Christianity, because, if you're Anglican, you'll be able to relate to hymns like "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching us to war." All right, well, this is the ethos that is transmitted from public schools to the entire British Empire, okay? Greek becomes an optional study because Cambridge and Oxford decided it wasn't a requirement for entry. And there was a slow introduction of what's called modern studies, whereby French and German, maths with an S on the end because it's not mathematic, but mathematics, so the English refer to it as maths, okay? That's just about it for modern studies. And there was constant conflict between the two. I already mentioned how the school physically expanded. And you see the speech room that was designed by the architect William Burgess, which I was very familiar with, and the Vaughan Library that, again, Scott was responsible for. The sixth formers were encouraged to do public and civil service. There was a parting of the ways with Oxford and Cambridge University because they no longer were schools, religious universities. They were ecumenical. They started looking at the sciences and so on and so forth. And the dons were being paid much better. So they had very little interest in teaching in public schools. That has changed again somewhat today. Harrow was always open to the commissions, such as the Clarendon Schools, Clarendon Commission, and in fact, because of the conflict of the endowment and the original purpose of the endowment, they established a John Lyon School, the John Lyon School, and they fund that entirely from the endowment. And it's for local boys, and it's free, okay? But it's still an independent school.
Wow.
Boarding houses, Harrow is quite different from other schools because physically it's quite different. It's spread out more because it had more lands. There are now 12 houses. When I was there were 11. They added Lyons because the school jumped from 750 when I was there to 830 or so. The conflict between the masters who owned the houses, etc., came to a head, and board of governors that ruled the school eventually forced the headmaster to take over they purchased all the houses. And therefore, masters' incomes went down appropriately. Even though there are added benefits of being the housemaster, you got bigger salary, etc. But we all identified with our house as much as with Harrow in general. So we had our own flannels. Those are colors. We all had our colors. I went to the Knoll, and they were black and gold. We had our own traditions. We had vicious intramural rivalries, sports for under 16 teams, and then the older boys teams, in music, in drama, in every conceivable way. Who'd win the music cup? Who'd win the speech cup? Et cetera, et cetera. Things changed after I left in 1977 when for economic reasons, instead of having 12 houses with each their own dining facilities and the expense of serving them, they had a central dining hall, which really has changed much of the configuration of Harrow. So Harrow stood for two things: the Church of England and the British Empire. Okay, and one of the headmasters in the mid-19th century, Weldon at Harrow, said the true good of education in public schools is not scholarship so much as citizenship. And flogging became a major component, as the French would call it, le vice anglaise. Punishment books were kept, detailing who got what for what. And in the period from 1888 to 1898, there were 917 floggings. That's about 92 a year, never less than 5 strokes. And sometimes you could accumulate dozens. Okay, you see the gentleman, Stanley Baldwin. He's an old Harrovian. In fact, when he was Prime Minister from 1923 to January 1924, and again November 1924 to 29, and again 1935 to 1937, insisted there be 6 cabinet ministers who were Harrovians. He was flogged for passing pornography on to Eton. Do you recognize the fellow? It's Winston Churchill.
Oh no.
Okay? He was flogged for missing detention. Okay? So, as they say, manliness moved from chapel, you know, and you've got your principles that you derive from chapel, to the changing room, sports. And they believed that games bred dignity, courtesy, and what we would call teamwork, what they call cooperation. Harrow is the first school to make games compulsory. It was a center of Freemasonry. My headmaster was a Freemason. The other religion or sects were not viewed upon that kindly. The first Catholic wasn't admitted until 1869. First Jewish person was Victor Rothschild in 1891, when they admitted not even a dozen Jews. They set up a separate Jewish house, which lasted for 11 years. Hindus and Muslims weren't accepted until the 20th century. Harrow, in many ways, reached its political heyday in the 19th century when Harrovians were prime ministers for more than half of the century. Spencer Perceval, who was the only prime minister to be assassinated by John Bellingham in 1812. Goodrich, whose real name was Robinson, he was only prime minister for just under 2 years. Robert Peel, you know, is the founder of the modern Conservative Party. He lost power in, you know, he was prime minister twice, but he lost power because of his repeal of the Corn Laws, his actual support for Irish education, and the landed aristocracy made sure, along with Lord Russell, that he was booted out of his office by his own party. George Hamilton Gordon, well, not greatly well known, but Lord Palmerston, one of the leading prime ministers of the 19th century, who was prime minister for a total of 10 years. His name was actually Henry John Temple. And at its heyday, 66 members of Parliament were old Harrovians, 33 from the Liberal Party and 33 from the Conservative Party. Okay. So, sports, which we call Ecker, was critical. The earliest competition was the Silver Arrow competition that went away and was replaced by Speech Day. Cricket, if you go Google or Wikipedia and you see old Harrovians, and you'll see more first-team cricketers listed than anything else. Hundreds of them. Well, they played against Eton every year since 1805 with a couple of interruptions, including the First and Second World War. We had our own Harrow football, which they continue to play. It's very obscure, ridiculous rules. It's played with this ball that's about 2 feet in diameter, leather, and flat on 2 sides. And you can kick and handle the ball, and there's all these silly rules that I do not have time to get into. But rugby became a pastime of public schools, so we played rugby one term, Harrow football another term, and cricket another. There were other games such as fives and squash. Squash was invented at Harrow, tennis, and they didn't have golf when I was there. They got a golf course now. They own their own golf course. Anyway, they have a magnificent sports center, an Olympic-sized pool indoor, all these facilities, all that's in the intervening years since I went there. Let me tell you, we had Ducker that was built in 1866. It was the longest pool in the UK, and you had to swim from one end to the other to pass your swimming test in a specific amount of time. I don't remember what it was. I just remember that the water was always seemingly brackish, and there was nothing appealing about Ducker whatsoever. Then I added, they now have 30 different sports, unbelievable. But most critically, and I add this, you know what a tosh is? It's a bath. And after playing these muddy games, I mean, you could be covered in mud, right? You'd run up the hill as fast as you could, no matter how exhausted you were. Why? So that you got first dibs on one of the 8 baths servicing 70 boys. Okay? And were you allowed to get rid of the water at the end of one and the next boy comes along? No. And did you have hot water after the first couple of boys had used that water? No. Were you limited as to how much time you could spend in that water? Yes. You know, so I don't know about the hygiene of it all. However, that's the way the system works. It's no longer extant. Thank goodness for the boys that go there today. Of course, they pay so much more than when I went there. The military played an important role, and you had the Harrow Rifle Corps. Actually, there I am, right there. It was a lot of drills, and they had drill competitions. There were overnight exercises. The one incident, because one thing that James, the headmaster, succeeded in doing was keeping Harrow's name out of any press. Well, my second year there was a major explosion in the house because some of the boys put together a bunch of thunder flashes on a timer, and somebody else came in and started throwing it around, and it blew up. And thank God the walls of the rooms were made out of basically cardboard, because if they hadn't been, poof, those boys would have been dead. As it was, there was a picture in the Daily Mail of the toilet that was on the other side of the hallway that had been blown out, blown a hole through the exterior of the building, and the toilet surreptitiously was serendipitous. Yes, landed upright in the middle of the road. In any case, luckily those boys, I mean, they were injured, but they pretty much recovered. So we did military exercise. We had to spend 3 weeks. I was with the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Division outside of Celle near Hanover in Germany, and got to play with little missiles and stuff like that. Oh, what fun. So, if you again look at old Harrovians, you see the numbers of Harrovians that had a military career. The impact of the First World War, when 2,917 Harrovians served in the war, 644 of them were killed and 690 grievously wounded. Far more than in the Second World War, when only 344 Harrovians were killed. One old Harrovian was Field Marshal Harold Alexander, the Earl of Tunis, who was responsible for all the Mediterranean operations and oversaw the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Harrow, there are 20 Victoria Cross recipients, 8 from World War I. Those are extremely limited decorations for valor. But as you can see, Harrow produced 3 field marshals, an air marshal, 2 admirals in the fleet, and just literally dozens and dozens of generals and rear admirals and the like. So because of the toll on the First World War, War Memorial, built in the neo-Tudor style, was built in 1926, and it's a memorial to those who lost their life. Okay, let's see if I can get this work. Now, I listened to something the other day, and I already had the history club, and Churchill would go to Harrow to listen to songs. So he went on Songs Day because he found them extremely soothing. It was not just nostalgia, but rousing and so on and so forth. He went in 1940 and again in 1941, and his speech was actually about 8.5 minutes in length. And it's well known.
In nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy.
So, yes, it was more than just never give in. Whoa. I don't know what happened there. There was very little in the way of foreigners. There were some titled foreigners. Nero was definitely an exception. In fact, he was an exception to the rule because towards the latter part of the 19th century, boys that were 7 years to 13, they went to prep schools like St. Peter's Court, no longer were public schools, and then it was ages 13, maximum 14. But Nero entered Harrow at the age of 15. His father was a very wealthy entrepreneur who had connections. There was very little in the way of diversity. There were others like King Faisal of Iraq in the 1930s who went there, and King Hussein of Jordan, and there were definitely some that from the Arab countries, including the Emir of Qatar, who went to Harrow. There were state examinations now, because prior to that, if you wanted to go to Harrow, if you wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you took the S level. And the state, from 1951, had started to reform the English educational system and had statewide entrance exams, so that people from state grammar schools and independent grammar schools could also go to university more easily. Beatings in all of the UK were banned in 1999. I believe Harrow had gotten rid of all beatings in the 1970s. Only Eton, Harrow, and Radley remained actual boys' boarding schools only. The others were now either co-ed, including just the last year, your senior year, or co-ed. So in the 60s, there was this perception that public school graduates were entitled and were toughs. You know, if you ever saw Michael Caine in the Ipcress file, it's really about a grammar school person in the intelligence services having to deal with a bunch of toughs. It's a derogatory term for sort of bumbling, not very bright, upper class aristocrats who were in charge. And then, of course, there was another film in the 1960s, If, which I don't know if you've ever seen, but it was extremely violent, and it was a parody about public schools. You know, in that age, the 1960s, England was a society that looked backwards with you know, considerable regret, and felt that you know, the nation had seen its best. There was a lot of social conflict. Labor got into power. Things seemingly were falling apart, etc., and a considerable class warfare, if you will. Actually, I wanted to add, in 1997, the scholarship exam, the S levels, were eliminated entirely because only those going to public schools could afford the added term or year to prepare themselves for the S exam. And that was unfair to all the grammar school and comprehensive schools in the country. So Harrow, as I mentioned, oratory preparation was very significant. Its most famous poets include Lord Byron, then you have the author Trevelyan, Richard Sheridan, the playwright and poet, Anthony Trollope, John Galsworthy, who won Nobel Prize. There was another old Harrovian who won Nobel Prize for Literature, anybody, Winston Churchill. Acting was definitely part of rhetoric and oratory, and you had Maurice Barrymore, the patriarch of the entire Barrymore acting family. Singer James Blunt, that's recent. He's started his career as a Coldstream Guard in the military. Edward Fox, you may recognize as the Day of the Jackal actor, his younger brother, James Fox, Max Bennett, who was a Master and Commander, and James Bellamy was Simon Williams in Upstairs, Downstairs, and of course, Benedict Cumberbatch. The traditions, so to form, you know, a unique social group, you bind them with rituals, traditions, and language. And so we had a number of traditions. Custos was generally a former non-commissioned officer who had spent his entire life in the military, retired, and then he was the enforcer of uniforms. And if your shoes weren't shining, if your shirt looked disheveled, if you weren't wearing your boater outside of class, etc., you would have to show up to Custos at 7 a.m. in proper uniform, apologize, and if you didn't show up in time, I mean exactly at 7 a.m., you got another Custos. You'd have to show up again. So some people accumulated like a couple of weeks worth, okay? Usually the same people. Founders Day was very significant. Songs is highly important. I brought my songbook that has over 50 songs written in the 19th, primarily 19th century. There was Bill. That was the roll call, where you'd have to take your hat, tap your hat to the headmaster, and roll call, instead of doing it in the main yard, was done at the houses most of the time. And actually at Harrow, in Speech Day, which supplanted the Silver Arrow competition, the head boy read in Latin to the whole school and the Board of Governors in Latin all the major events of that particular year. And then in addition to that, the Old Boys Network was the first school to develop a boys network, Old Boys, and they've been critical in getting Harrow over the bad bumps, if you will. And now it's just like in this country, you know, how many phone calls or emails can you possibly get for more money? It started this whole kind of cult of Harrow and the clubs and membership into the clubs and this interweaving of the networks between government officials and leaders of industry, et cetera, et cetera. And I mentioned here Tuck Shop. Well, the Tuck Shop the food was so atrocious when I went there. I mean, unbelievably atrocious. For breakfast, all I remember was 5 days a week there was fried bread and either stewed tomatoes out of a can or scrambled eggs made from powdered eggs. I mean, just, it was awful. And lunch, which was the main meal, they were roasts that you know, had more grizzle than they actually had meat. And I could go on and on. In fact, to the point that we would look forward to desserts like spotted dick, which is the steamed suet pudding with currants in it, served with the, you know, the treacle. I mean, that was something to look forward to. Okay, so Tuck Shop, you'd go and get your money that your parents had given to the housemaster, and you'd have to say, please, sir, I'd like two bob, you know, 2 shillings. And you'd go to the Tuck Shop and you'd get your chips with vinegar or chips with fried eggs or something of that nature, just for, you know, to revive your taste buds, if you will. So some of the terminology could include beak, lure. I kind of wore as close as I could find my Harrow outfit, blue and gray. The double lines, so if you got a double, you'd have to do these writing exercises, and woe betide you if any letter got outside of the double lines. You'd have to start all over again because you did it in pen, so you'd have to go and find the, you know, whoever issued the double, and you'd get added double, and on it would go. I already talked about Ecker and flannel. Groys is like an Edwardian expression for nerd. The Phil Athletic Club was those that were like monitors, but they were not quite the same. They had added special privileges. Atosh, I already told you about. The skew was if your master gave you, and the double lines tended to be even more extreme. They could be Christmas double lines where one line was in red, one was in green, one was plain, and you'd have to continue that way. And if the beak was really nasty, one letter was one color, the next letter was another color. Yeah. So trials were internal exams, and the classes, the 9th grade was called shell, the 10th grade was kind of remove, lower and upper 5th, and lower and upper 6th. I'm not going to get too much into this, just to tell you that today, Harrow, the academic competencies have risen greatly. Instead of what used to be called O-levels, they're called GCSEs or IGCSEs, and they take 9 or 10. I think I took 9. And 4 or 5 A-levels. I took 2. Which was standard back then, 2 or 3. And today, 65% of the Harrovians enter the top 100 world universities. And in fact, last year, 32 Harrovians were offered places at the top 10 colleges in the United States, like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago, etc. Much greater breadth of studies today, computer competencies, etc., and a huge focus on world-class facilities, no physical discipline. On the actual reverse, the monitors now are mentors. And the matrons, we had a matron, you know, if you had a headache or needed to be seen, you know, matron, you'd go see matron. If you had a fever, then she'd call the school nurse, and then you might go in an actual separate ward you know, because God forbid somebody had measles or something of the sort, although we did get vaccinated. And the masters, I have 20% plus have terminal degrees, PhDs. There's far more cultural, racial, and religious diversity. And foreign enrollment, not at Harrow, but all public schools now include 16%. I was kind of horrified to see that 3,000 Russians from the oligarchical families were attending English public schools. Wow. So the shells, you know, you were getting ready for your GCSEs. And they're pretty tough exams. You know, if you want to go to an American university, you're not required to take your A-levels. It's like an additional year. So university in England is only 3 years. So, you know, I was doing, I don't remember any of it, but I was doing algebra at St. Peter's Court. And it didn't really mean much to me. All I know is you had to learn all those equations, and God forbid, you know, if you didn't do well, because, you know, there was always the overhanging king. What did Harrow inculcate the boys with? Well, ability to concentrate and lead, perseverance, leadership, competitiveness for sure, love of sports, loyalty, inflated egos, bumptiousness, and eccentricities. You know, eccentricities is a means by which you can break convention and hide your individuality. It doesn't just mean, as some people believe, a cover for homosexuality. Eccentric behavior was a means by which one could demonstrate one's individuality within a certain context. Certainly, when I was there, not nearly so much so, not since the Princess Di era, but, you know, it was all about, this didn't overlip, you know, emotions. Oh, good God, man. We don't talk about such things. Yep. Ridiculous. And I think Harrow's genius has been to preserve the facade of traditions and, in a sense, the cult, while transforming itself and still portraying itself as a continuity. Things haven't changed. It's all about the traditions. Well, it's greatly changed. And my headmaster said, one really must not destroy illusions because there isn't anything to be served by doing so. Yeah, okay. And adding that lots of people would be upset if what they've always been told was said to be not quite true. Absolutely. So, because of time, I'm going to skip this except to say that all attempts at reforming or abolishing public schools from the 19th to the 21st century have dismally failed. And in part because both major political parties are led by people who went to public schools. Okay? But the criticism of it is that only 7% of the United Kingdom students attend fee-paying schools. And the 9 Clarendon schools educate 0.15%, but they're 10% of who's who of Great Britain. Public schools claim charitable status, and they receive £200 million of taxpayer money to subsidize the boys of diplomats, military, foreign service, etc., and civil service. The Independent School Council claims that 168,000 were given, students were given discounts, but many of those are within the category that I just mentioned. It really is a preservation, and there's a great deal of criticism that public schools have maintained the class divisions that still survive to this day in the United Kingdom. There's all these networks and entanglements where, you know, I haven't even mentioned the girls' public schools and boardings, but they exist. I mean, the leading English girls' school is Benenden, that has a 4-year waiting list. Wow. Okay, from people from all over the world, because it's gone from the landed aristocracy to city wealth to the plutocrats from throughout the world. Okay, and here's just an example: 74% of senior judges are public school alum. 71% of the military and naval officers, 55% of the permanent secretaries in Whitehall, 53% of senior diplomats, 50% of the House of Lords, 44% of leading business leaders, 43% of newspaper editors, and 33%, which is quite a drop, are public schools. But 34% of Cambridge and 25% of Oxford were students of fee-paying independent schools. And the London School of Economics in 2017 demonstrated that the Clarendon School graduate are 94 times more likely to reach the most powerful positions in British society. Some criticisms, some are fairly amusing. Evelyn Wallace said you'd feel perfectly at home in prison. In fact, another gentleman who was a minister who was in prison said this will be easier than my life at public school. George Orwell thought that the brutality that administrators from the British Empire learnt that brutality by having come from public schools. And then the British Journal of Psychotherapy said that there are a number of issues with this kind of school in which the true identity of the self is hidden as a means to preserve the person. Now, lastly, Harrow has opened 10 international sister schools. Harrow School at Aki in Japan, and all the other cities. I don't need to mention to them. I don't know what the impact of the government's ruling on education will be. And I just read recently that there will be 4 Harrow schools in India and 1 in, God forbid, Oakdale, Long Island. Okay. I don't know that this serves the brand well. What it does do, and they make plain at their own website, is to increase the bursaries, the money, okay, to help support those who need financial support, because the cost of public school education, I mean, at Harrow, is over £40,000. Okay, so you know, this is definitely problematic. And I just come back that the United States, even though we don't focus on it much in this country, it does beg the question, because many studies in England, in comparison to other EU countries, where independent schools are not even allowed. You know, they're not allowed. And they don't have the kind of social divisions that we see in the UK or in this country. And so it begs the question, not so much of us maybe, but younger people, what kind of society do they want to live in? And is there really equality of opportunity when you have these kinds of systems in place? And that is a question that I never thought of when I was there, of course, because I was privileged. I'll just let you know that the tuition at Harrow at the time, I thought it was £3,000, but it actually was £1,600. And today it's over £40,000. And you see it in all the world-class facilities, and I see how much more they're going to create. And is this the best thing for the United Kingdom? I don't have an answer for that, but it definitely is a question that needs to be posed, as well as in this country. And with that, I thank you, and sorry for the